And on the third day of wandering, somebody shot at the four from far away. Shot 4 times as they crossed a narrow brick road. One shot was for the scouts. The next was for the anti-tank gunner, whose name was Roland Weary. The third bullet was for the filthy flamingo, who stopped dead center in the road when the lethal bee buzzed past his ear. Billy stood there politely, giving the marksman another chance. It was his addled understanding of the rules of warfare that the marksman should be given a second chance. The next shot missed Billy's kneecaps by inches, going end on end from the sound of it. Roland Weary and the scouts were safe in a ditch, and Weary growled at Billy, "Get out of the road, you dumb motherfucker!" The last word was still a novelty in the speech of white people in 1944. It was fresh and astonishing to Billy, who had never fucked anybody. And it did its job. It woke him up and got him off the road. I do love a good banned book. And Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut is one of the best. I remember the first time I read it. I was in high school. One day I had my face in it in the few minutes before class, and this kid next to me asked, "Hey, what do you think of that book?" I said, "It's great," or something to that effect. And he said, I didn't really like the style of it. It was too weird. It jumps around too much," or something to that effect. And I thought, wow, I do not need to associate any further with this person. But my love for this particular banned book is beside the point. It's Banned Books Week again. Okay, that was last week. I'm always behind schedule. But anyway, this year I want to challenge what exactly we consider to be a banned book. Plenty of discussions about Banned Books Week will no doubt focus on the most challenged books of recent years, like Looking for Alaska, or Persepolis, or I Am Jazz, or even Harry Potter. These books may have been challenged or even removed from some schools or libraries, but last time I checked, these books were still widely available at bookstores or on Amazon. Now, does that mean no harm has been done? Absolutely not. Not everyone can afford to buy books, and school might be the only place some kids will encounter ideas that might challenge their beliefs or allow them to empathize with people from other backgrounds. So yes, we need to push back against these vocal busybodies who have too much power over our children's minds. We need to ask ourselves, what is it about our system that gives these people the power to intimidate librarians into pulling books from the shelves? But that's not what I want to talk about today. Like I said, the books challenged by these groups are still widely available. I want to talk about books you really can't find on shelves, books that have already disappeared from our cultural consciousness, and books that you will never be allowed to read because they won't be published. The culprit this time isn't a moral crusading organization like the Moral Majority, who were responsible for the initial book banning craze. It's something far more insidious, because we're more likely to accept it as legitimate. What I'm talking about is copyright. Let me clarify. Copyright in and of itself is a good thing. Artists, musicians, writers, they all gotta get paid to keep doing what they're doing. So it's not copyright itself that's the problem. Rather, it's our copyright laws in the USA. Specifically, how long creative works remain under copyright. Now, US copyright law is pretty Byzantine. Sorry, Byzantium. But basically, since the 1998 Copyright Extension Act, the law says a creative work, such as a painting, a song, or book, remains under copyright for the life of the author plus 70 years. Or for corporate works, a flat term of 95 years. Either way, that's way too long. So what does this have to do with banning books exactly? Well, in a paper by Professor Paul Heald of the University of Illinois titled "How Copyright Keeps Works Disappeared," Heald identifies a phenomenon known as the mid-20th century black hole. Now, what this refers to is the relative paucity of available titles from the mid-20th century as opposed to the late 19th century and the early 20th century, before 1923. More or less everything published before 1923 is in the public domain. That means anyone is free to download, copy, and read a pre-1923 book, or even use the settings and characters for their own creative works. That's why we have so many great, and some not so great, adaptations of things like Shakespeare's plays and Sherlock Holmes stories. Basically, Heald wanted to test whether old books in the public domain were more available than old books still under copyright. So he compared the availability of titles from before 1923 with the availability of titles from 1923 and after. Now, one would think the further back in time you go, the fewer works would be in print, since, number one, time eventually makes dust out of everything, and number two, modern technology allows more works to be published than in the past. But it turns out that according to Heald's study, there are twice as many books from the 1890s available on Amazon than there are from the 1950s. And a given book from the 1880s is more likely to be available than a given book from the 1980s. And when you compile all the data, the picture looks like this. There is a clear drop in availability of works beginning in the 1920s, and we don't start climbing out of it until the 2000s. This is the mid-20th century black hole. Books from the 20th century, a century of world wars, nuclear weapons, civil rights, and decolonization, are less likely to be in print than books from the 19th century, a century of empires and colonization. What could possibly account for this strange disparity? You guessed it, copyright. A work from before 1923 is in the public domain, and therefore costs virtually nothing to be made available. You can post it on your blog, release it as an Amazon ebook, or record yourself reading it on YouTube, and no one can do anything about it. You don't have to pay anyone a cent. You can print the entire thing relatively cheaply and sell it to a small audience. And you could make your money back since your upfront costs would be so low. Now, let's say you had a work from the mid-20th century. Works from the mid-20th century are old enough to have disappeared from the public imagination, but young enough that they are still under copyright. That means anyone who wanted to make sure such a work was available would need to track down the copyright holders, who might be the authors themselves, but could also be their estate or some other entity who owns the rights. People who had nothing to do with writing the book and nothing to do with the initial investment to print it. Anyway, once they tracked down whoever wrote it, or whoever it is, they would need to pay them to publish the work, which means that only commercially viable works from that time will remain available. Sure, there might be some overlooked gems, but how are you going to convince someone to pay for the rights to publish them? Furthermore, some books might not be commercially viable at all, but they may contain valuable historical perspectives and information. But who wants to pay anything for that? As a result, many of these works will languish in obscurity, appearing on fewer and fewer shelves until they are all lost forever. With copyright laws as they are, we are effectively burning books. But excessive copyright not only reduces published works to dust, it could also potentially prevent works from ever being published. Duke University's Center for the Study of the Public Domain cites the example of Alice Randall's The Wind Done Gone as an example of copyright law being used to attempt to censor. The Wind Done Gone was a 2001 retelling of Margaret Mitchell's Gone with the Wind, told from the perspective of the slaves. Gone with the Wind is as notorious for its backward, romanticized portrayal of slavery as it is beloved for its love story between Scarlet and Red. I don't know, I haven't read the book. And The Wind Done Gone gave it its deserved comeuppance. When Mitchell's estate got wind of Randall's book, They were, of course, very gracious and offered their blessing for the project. Just kidding. They did just what you'd expect spoiled brats who haven't worked for their fortune to do. They sued. Randall's publisher claimed her work was protected as a parody of the original, and the court seemed to agree. But the two parties ultimately ended up settling outside of court, and the book became a bestseller. Yes, in this case, the book was published, but how many other authors have been intimidated into withdrawing their books? How many other authors have lacked the backing of a powerful publisher? Do we really think the parity defense will always work in our capricious judicial system? If we had sane lengths of copyright terms, say 60 years, a flat 60 years, Gone with the Wind, published in 1936, would already be in the public domain. And a book like The Wind Done Gone could be published without any hassle because its plot, characters, and setting would be free for anyone to use. This may be the case for many other beloved characters too. Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman, and James Bond would all be in the public domain. Right now, underrepresented groups are fighting for positive depiction in our popular culture. But if we had sane copyright laws, these groups wouldn't have to wait until Hollywood decides it's time for a black Superman or an Asian Batman. They would be empowered to reimagine these characters for themselves. And there wouldn't be a damn thing anyone could do about it. So these are my 2 cents on Banned Books Week. Copyright is a censorship issue and a diversity issue, and it very much affects our freedom to read. My name is Alex, and to use a phrase that may or may not be copyrighted or trademarked, I'll see you next time.